I don't want no oil a-spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes! Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to all of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and you have had the wonderful good fortune to tune into For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment, and we talk about it in the ways that it affects you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and your family, and the fish in the streams and the birds in the air and the worms in the ground and pretty much everybody and everything, because, like it or not, all of us are wrapped up together on this big old wibbly wobbly ball called Earth. And if all is going according to plan, today I'm in another part of the Earth. I'm way over there in western New York, attending a family gathering, a wedding of a nephew. Very nice. But it means this is a recorded episode, so you won't be able to call in. But it lives up to our usual standards of excellence in that we still have our interview with Rebecca. She's going to be talking to us about honeysuckle. And we have a very nice interview with Molly Nichols from the Sierra Club. And she's going to be talking about the latest campaign they have. They're going directly to the Public Utilities Commission. Well, they're getting the public to go directly to the Public Utilities Commission to demand that they stop giving OVAC, the bailouts from House Bill 6, the ridiculous bailouts that cost you and me and everybody in Ohio who pays an electric bill. We're getting directly penalized in order to subsidize these coal plants, and that's the legacy of House Bill 6, so we'll be talking about that. But for the next few minutes here, I'm going to be talking, we're just going to chat a little bit about this and that, and it's nice that we're having an actual fall this year. I mean, it's really, kind of the way we remember it, a little bit of frost, kind of cold in October. There's plenty of places in the world where that's not the case. There's plenty of places like British Columbia, China, that are still having record heat for this time of the year, and having record drought, I might also add. But we're kind of in a nice place right now. We've got the leaves are turning. A lot of them have turned already. We got a lot of really beautiful walks in the fall foliage. In fact, I saw somebody's offering helicopter tours of the area to go look at pretty trees. And psychologically, us humans, we really want things to be normal. And so when we get a nice normal fall like this one, it's kind of easy to sort of put out of your mind the whole idea that we've got this global warming crisis, because we could say, well, this year was fine. Look, there's no problem. And of course the reality is that we still don't know what's going to happen the rest of the year. It might stay like this all the way through December, which would not be normal, although a lot of people would be happy. And we have to look at the overall trends. We have to look at what's happening globally. And we've got a couple of those global stories coming up at the last part of the show, where we will talk about ecological news stories. But this psychology thing, that we have to realize that as humans, we are able to be manipulated psychologically. I mean, it'd be nice, it's nice to think, oh, I'm above that. I can't be manipulated psychologically. In fact, almost everybody thinks that. But in fact, we are all subject to sort of the same sets of conditions, and if conditions are right, almost anybody can be manipulated psychologically. I mean, it's actually happened to me. I I consider myself a fairly intelligent guy and fairly with it, but I actually went and spent some time. I got invited to a weekend with the Moonies. That's a cult a lot of people aren't familiar with anymore. It was really big in the 80s and 90s. The Reverend Sung Myung Moon basically proclaimed himself the second coming of Christ. And yeah, I know it sounds ridiculous, but I went and spent a weekend with them, and it was 3 days of sleep deprivation and intense psychological manipulation, which didn't feel like psychological manipulation to me at the time. It just felt like people being nice. But at the end of that, I was almost sucked into that cult. I mean, what saved me was my wife, Carolyn Cueca. We arranged that she would come on the last day, so I was there for the full 3 days, but she was just coming for the afternoon of that third day. And she took one look at me and she grabbed me and said, "We're going for a walk, Joe." And so we started walking around the block, and she said, "Okay, tell me everything they said." And so, I'm going on that one side. I'm like, "Oh, well, they said this and this, and that's, it's kind of reasonable." And then we turned the corner, and then I was going, "Oh, yeah, but, they didn't really explain this and this. And, oh, there's a little bit of contradiction." And then when we turned the third corner, I was like, "Let's get out of here." So we just kept going, got right back in her car, and drove away. But it was a real eye opener for me that, put people in the right situations, push the right buttons, give them the right psychological triggers, and you can really, really change people's opinions. And that is the basis. One thing I've mentioned before, that a lot of pro-nuclear kooks, they kind of worship, sort of their unofficial Bible is this trilogy of books by the great Isaac Asimov. And Isaac Asimov was a wonderful writer, and he knew a whole bunch about biology and electronics, and a very prolific guy in the early part of the 20th century, and a great science fiction writer too. And so he created something called the Foundation Trilogy. And the Foundation Trilogy is a book about a bunch of nuclear scientists who realize that the big empire they're part of is doomed and is going to collapse. And so they create this little protected hive of psychological scientists and nuclear scientists who basically sort of help the empire collapse, and then after it collapses, they just take over, because A, they know how to psychologically manipulate people, and B, since they're so knowledgeable about atomic physics and atomic power, they're obviously the smartest people, and so they're obviously the ones that should be running everything. And, that's a very tempting worldview for people that are like physicists and in the nuclear industry. And it's sort of the unofficial Bible of the nuclear power community. They've all read it and sort of taken it to heart. But at its heart, it's insane, because none of us, no group of us, even the atomic physicists, are smart enough to understand everything, the whole picture of our society, the wants and needs of the people, and the wants and needs of the other creatures and the plants and the microscopic organisms that we're sharing this lifeboat with, because we're all the situation is we're all on this lifeboat. I mean, the part of the Foundation trilogy is that there's this big galactic empire that spans the whole galaxy, and people just hop from planet to planet, uh, barely without even thinking about it because they've got the technology. But the reality is, of course, that we are all together on this really tiny planet, and everything we do to any part of it affects all of us. And I don't really blame Isaac Asimov so much because he came from a time before we started studying ecology, before scientists really looked at this idea that everything is interconnected and everything has to have its place and has to have its share of the earth in order for all of us to survive. No, he came from this time when science was all about plucking out every little bit and looking at each piece individually and becoming, like becoming a chemist or becoming an engineer or becoming an atomic scientist. And so everybody had their little piece of the truth. And Isaac Asimov was kind of unique in that he spanned a lot of those disciplines. He wrote stuff on chemistry but he never put the whole thing back together into like an ecological picture of the world. For him, plants and animals were just sort of there. They were just kind of the background for the stories he wanted to tell. And the reality, of course, is that the forests, the plants, the animals, they are, ecologically speaking, just as important as humans in this whole big picture. And he, of course, was from the time when, humans were the most intelligent species. So, of course, we should dominate everything, and we should, all the worlds that got people on them were transformed into, he described planet-wide cities, for example, which are an ecological impossibility. I mean, if you cover a planet with nothing but buildings and roads and try to cover a planet with human city style habitation, that planet is not going to be able to support itself. The atmosphere itself would degrade and become unlivable. And so it's just a case where when we're looking at the real world around us and we see the beauty of it, it's easy for us to get pulled away by this psychological manipulation and get more into our own heads and less out looking at the world around us and less at looking at the big picture. And it's easy when you are psychologically manipulating somebody, you want them to get to narrow their focus as much as possible. You want to, instead of broadening their horizons, you want them to focus on that thing or that person or that cult leader that your cult is based on. And if you can succeed in doing that, then you can basically put people to work for you, and it can be extremely lucrative. You could, people who get sucked into these cults, the cult leaders are unimaginably wealthy because they've got the efforts of all these people working for them. And so I guess the way I'm kind of pulling all this together is the idea that the nuclear industry is a cult. I mean, in fact, it's been called the cult of the atom. And I've had to deal with some of these people that just believe nuclear power is the answer to literally every ill that humans face, when in fact we know, looking at it from the outside, that it causes unimaginable suffering. There's a big story right now about Coldwater Creek, which is in California. It's a community that got contaminated by atomic experiments back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And those people suffer terribly. They have incredible diseases of all sorts because one of the aspects of nuclear pollution is it's random. When you start zapping people with nuclear radiation, you don't know which of their biological systems are going to fail. You don't know if they're going to get cancer or if they're going to have an autoimmune disease, or they might get heart disease, or they might develop bone diseases, osteoporosis, and things like that, because the effect of radiation is random, and that's part of what makes it hard to pin down just how much damage it's doing to all of us. But there is no question it's damaging us, and so things can look beautiful. I mean, even some of the most contaminated areas in the world, you look at them, there's trees growing, it's fall now, the leaves are turning, they look beautiful, but radiation is invisible, and you have to have an understanding of ecology to understand just how horrible that is. And so things can look good, like we can have a nice fall, but you have to look at the entire picture to really understand is if they are good or not. And so one thing we know that isn't good is House Bill 6. We've reported on it many times. And so today's interview is with Molly Nichols, who's trying to overturn that horrible piece of legislation. So without further ado, let's hear from Molly Nichols of the Sierra Club. Welcome to For a Green Future. Could you just share with us your name and who you're with?
Sure. My name is Molly Nichols. I'm an organizing representative with the Beyond Coal campaign with the Sierra Club.
Molly, I'm having you on to talk about an issue that we've been following from the beginning, sort of the latest attempt to redo or revisit the harm from HB 6. Could you give us a little bit of background there?
Sure. So I think most listeners are aware of HB 6, a bill that was passed in 2019 in Ohio and was originally supposed to help cover expenses for First Energy and their nuclear plants, as well as getting rid of energy efficiency and renewable energy in Ohio, including a bailout of 2 coal plants, where that bailout already existed, but HB 6 was a way to extend and expand that bailout. And interestingly, the utilities that own those coal plants were not on board with HB 6, but once they added this, additional money for them from customers, they got on board to support HB 6. We've since found out, obviously, that HB 6 was the product of this massive bribery scheme led by Larry Householder that was exposed in 2020. And some aspects of the bill have gone away, especially the subsidy for First Energy and the nuclear plants. But much of HB 6 is still on the books. It's pretty astounding, including this bailout of these coal plants, that one's in Ohio called Kyger Creek, and one is actually in Indiana called Clifty Creek. I can talk a little bit about the history of them in a second, but just to say that we've already, ratepayers have already paid close to $180 million for these coal plants to continue to operate because they've been operating in the red for decades. And we're projected to pay up to $700 million to help these plants continue to operate and spew out very dirty chemicals, causing lots of pollution and problems. So we, the Sierra Club, and many partners have obviously been really pushing to get HB 6 repealed completely at the state legislature. There were some bills that were proposed, including bipartisan ones, and they've always stalled in committee and not made it further than that, despite pressure from hundreds and thousands of people around the state to say that these need to be repealed. But our more recent campaign is also pressuring the Public Utilities Commission. So they are who regulate all the utilities in the state of Ohio. And they had actually given this bailout to these companies, the OVEC, the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation, who owns these coal plants. Back, I think the first subsidy started in 2017, and then HB 6 extended and expanded them. But now we're pressuring the Public Utilities Commission to say you need to protect customers from having to pay these ridiculous charges to benefit these coal plants. So we have a campaign pressuring the Public Utilities Commission in addition to the state legislature.
Okay. And now, would you say OVEC? Who exactly is OVEC?
Yeah, so it's the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation, and it is a consortium of different utilities. The most prominent ones we know are AEP, Dayton Power and Light, and AES Ohio. And these coal plants were actually built in the 1950s under Dwight D. Eisenhower and were used for uranium enrichment. And that was for a few decades. And then that contract, I think that must have been with the federal government, expired in the early 2000s. And then a bunch of utilities came together and renegotiated a new contract to deliver electricity just to residential customers throughout Ohio and other states. That they made a decision in 2011 to invest, I think, over $1 billion on scrubbers on these coal plants so that they could continue to operate under new EPA rules. And basically, ever since that deal, it's been a bad deal for them. They realized how they were only going to operate at a loss. They should have made a different decision back then than they did to, invest over $1 billion to keep the coal plants running. And they went to the Public Utilities Commission in about 2015 saying, hey, we need some help to keep operating. They basically want us to cover their debt and convince the Public Utilities Commission that this should happen. It was some argument about we have to hedge against any future energy price increases, and we need these plants to continue operating. So this is what you have to do to keep it, solvent for these obviously investor-owned utilities. And the PUCO said yes. And from then on, Ohioans were footing the bill for this bad deal that was made back in 2011. People will claim they're not just one company, right? It's a whole consortium of utilities. They say they can't get out of the contract, where there's plenty of things they could do to divest, which the Public Utilities Commission has actually ordered the utilities that they should be divesting from this investment, but they haven't taken any steps to do so. So they have just basically realized we made a bad deal. These coal plants are only costing us money. We're going to make Ohioans cover it for us. So we'll continue to reap our profits. And, it's pretty astounding, really. Even more, we'll extend it till 2030 through HB6. And now all residential customers are paying, including First Energy customers, for this bailout.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, all the discussion of like inflation right now, and then here the state comes along and just tax money onto all our electric bills to support these coal plants.
Yeah, and you will hear just this past year, they are giving a very small credit for the first time since this whole thing happened. So they're trying to tout that as this amazing thing, but it's only because of the war in Ukraine, because of Russia as a natural gas producer. As you know, it's affected energy prices, gas prices, everything like that. So they can now try to tell, but it's literally like 6 cents a month or something. It doesn't even pale in comparison to the $180 million we've already spent and are projected to still spend $700 million up through at least till 2030, and then they'd likely come back for more because their contract goes all the way to 2040.
Yeah, it is crazy, and so you guys have started a postcard drive talking about this. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So we had been pressuring the state legislature, repeal HB6, stop the OVEC bailouts. They are in the position to really end them once and for all, but we also decided we need to pressure the Public Utilities Commission. And so we are doing a postcard campaign. There's also an online action alert, and I can share at the end the best way people can plug in if they want to participate, where the Public Utilities Commission has already done an audit of the expenses that we're paying for the OVEC plants and are expected to do another audit for more recent years. Part of HB6 requires them to do this audit and say that all the costs associated with the plant need to be quote unquote prudent. So if the PUCO determines these costs are imprudent, they technically could, if not, at least limit the amount that we're paying for the coal plants, if not, end the bailouts altogether. So they already did one audit and determined, one, they continue to operate at a loss and aren't benefiting customers, and two, they're operating the plants at inefficient times, which makes it more costly than they should be. This next audit, they don't have a procedural schedule for, so we're pushing for that to happen and make sure there's like adequate opportunities for public input. I think when that comes, we're hoping we can do even more pressure on the Public Utilities Commission, showing up at their meetings, speaking at their hearings, to just say, this is ridiculous. You cannot continue to make Ohioans pay to cover the cost of these coal plants. So we're just trying to build as much pressure as possible on the Public Utilities Commission, hopefully the legislature would also see that. But that's the hope, is to have as many people as possible weigh in and say how unacceptable it is for these bailouts to continue. And, you know, as it's starting to get colder, it's just astounding that these utilities will cut off people's electricity for failure to pay. People are in debt. People have to go through all these things to try to avoid shutoffs. And then meanwhile, they're still making people, every single residential customer in Ohio pays to keep these coal plants running. Like, it's almost 2023, and we are paying for this fossil fuel infrastructure to continue, operate at a loss, spew chemicals and poison into the air. It's got to stop.
Yeah, I was going to ask a little bit about that, because you mentioned how old these plants are, and they are actually some of the most polluting plants in the country, right?
They are. I have some numbers. Let me just pull these up. So they did put those scrubbers on in 2011, but those could only go so far. That was to make sure they were covering some EPA requirements. But they are among the dirtiest in the country. They've emitted more than 27 million tons of carbon dioxide, 26,000 tons of nitrogen oxide, and 15,000 tons of sulfur dioxide. That's just since January 2020. So it's a major problem. I also know, I'm not a super expert on this, but the EPA has recently done a deeper dive into Clifty Creek and Gavin, the plant in Cheshire, Ohio. And we're expecting one to come for Kyger Creek, which is another one of the OVEC coal plants. They have unlined coal ash ponds, which technically an unlined coal ash is like the byproduct that the coal plants produce. And they need a place to put it. They put it in these ponds. And they're unlined, meaning all the chemicals leach into the ground, into groundwater. And so they've been asking for extensions of their permits to have these coal ash ponds. And the EPA is determining whether or not to grant them the extension. And they did a draft determination, at least for Clifty Creek and Gavin, saying, no, you can't continue to keep these coal ash ponds this way. So they'd have to stop operations until they come up with another way to mitigate it, or ideally shut the plants down and make a plan for a just transition for renewable energy. But that's another factor here of the impacts of that coal ash. And fortunately, the EPA is moving kind of slowly on this. It's already been delayed. It should have been, the decisions should be out sooner than they have been. But that's another way that we can push to get the coal plants to even cease operation if they're not able to use those coal ash unlined ponds.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, because I'm thinking back to the very beginning of the House Bill 6 process, and at that time it was being touted as a anti-global warming law, because mostly it was subsidizing the nuclear plants.
Yeah.
Right. But now it's kind of ironic that pretty much all that's left of House Bill 6 is subsidizing global warming.
That's right. And gutting the energy efficiency standards and the renewable portfolio standards for the state. You're right. I mean, it's literally just propping up the fossil fuel industry infrastructure, really covering their debts that they don't want to have to pay, and they're getting away with it. And we are really encouraging people. A lot of people haven't heard of the OVEC plants. They don't know that HB6 included these bailouts. So we're really hoping that more and more Ohioans can just be aware of the injustice here and to make their voices known to both the legislature, but especially now the Public Utilities Commission.
All right. And so if people wanted to find out more about that, how would they go about this?
Yeah, the best way would actually be to just email me. We have some live actions happening, and they're not quite on our website, so it's better if they email me, Molly with a Y, Molly .Nichols Nichols at sierraclub.org. And yeah, happy to hear from folks and figure out ways for you to plug in, whether it's helping with the postcard campaign or taking online actions. We're hoping we can go to a Public Utilities Commission, hopefully sometime in the new year, and keep an eye on this second audit that's coming up. Yeah, we'd love to have people get involved and help us push to stop these bailouts.
Yeah, and I think one of the incredible lessons of this whole thing is finding out just how literally and figuratively dirty Ohio politics are at the state level.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm glad you're fighting them.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think having the state legislature, obviously this was this national scandal of what happened, but then we also know Sam Randazzo is the head of the Public Utilities Commission. His home was raided by the FBI. I guess he hasn't gotten any charges yet, but we need to take on the people in power right now on all fronts here. And we also are really committed to working to democratize our energy system. Right now, these decisions are made by investor-owned utilities who are mainly, their priority is a profit, and they, give their money to the politicians who make these decisions about what money we're giving on our bills. And we really want to move toward a much more democratic structure where we have a lot more say over where energy comes from, how it's distributed, in the hopes that, we can have a much more equitable system, not only for us and our economics, but also for the benefit of the planet.
And that was our interview with Molly Nichols. Thanks for listening. And now it's time for one of my favorite parts of the show. We hear from our advertisers and patrons. For Green Future is brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats, and they lead outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. And there's several ways to get a hold of them and find out what they're doing. One is to call them at 419-353-1897. That's 419-353-1897. Another is to go to their website, which is wcparks.org. And they also have an app that you can download from any app store. Just go to the store and search for WC Parks. And, of course, they're on all the social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc., etc., etc. That's the Wood County Park District. And For a Green Future is also brought to you by our patrons. And our patrons are wonderful, wonderful people who've gone to patreon.com. And there they searched for a Green Future. Up popped our Patreon page, and they picked a level of membership there that matched their budgets and their commitment. And every month a little bit comes out of their checking account, comes over to us. And that's how we can afford to keep this show on the air. Because unfortunately, it's not free. We don't have free, quote unquote, free speech. We've got to pay to have the time on the radio and to put the show together and to do all the amazing things we do here on For a Green Future. So we're very, very grateful to our patrons. And we're also grateful to Rebecca Wood, who every week comes up with an interesting little tidbit talking about the natural world. And so let's go to that right now. Hey, Rebecca.
Hi there.
All right. Are you ready to talk about honeysuckle?
You betcha.
Okay. What do we need to know?
Okay, well, I decided to do honeysuckle because special request of Joe. Plus, there's patches around my neighborhood. There's one down on the fence, a couple houses away, and then there's also a Detroit Old Swain Field, which is the thing that it's a Detroit and Monroe. It's Saloons call it that because it used to be the mud hens practice field. But yeah, there's this big patch that hangs over the sidewalk because no one ever trims it. So you either gotta go 10 feet to find a gap through the hedge to get around it and cut into the parking lot, or else step out into Detroit Avenue which is a very busy street, for a few steps, or just go ahead and charge straight forward and hope you don't end up panicking and getting stung by a bee and stepping out into Detroit when you don't expect it.
Right, or getting your hair.
What, sorry?
Or you could choose to get your head covered in honeysuckle berries.
Something, yeah. Well, it attracts a lot of bees, is the thing. The pollinators love this stuff. As I've been confirmed by my quote-unquote research here. Honeysuckle is basically the genus Lonicera in the family Caprifoliaceae, which is the honeysuckle family, basically. It's known for honeysuckle. But yeah, they have very fragrant flowers. There's 180 species split between North America and Eurasia. And apparently Japonica and several other species are invasive in North America, Europe, South America, Australia, and Africa. Japonica is white, and it has a red stem for part of its cycle. And what's the other thing? Oh, yeah, blackberries. There's 180 species, though, so, it's going to be hard to identify exactly without a botany degree whether or not what you've got is Japonica, which is invasive, or no. So that's a problem. It's named after a guy named Adam Lonifer, who I guess discovered it or something. Hummingbirds, as well as bees, like them quite a bit. Most of them are climbing twiners, and a few are shrubs, which those get used for box hedges and gardens a lot. Otherwise, gardeners love them because they can cover unsightly walls and other things that, you can get climb up and look better than just plain fence or whatever. Most of them are deciduous, a few are evergreens, and the stems are very strong and used for binding in textiles. I had never heard of that. Also, Chinese medicine. They're used in Chinese traditional medicine. Most species berries are mildly poisonous, but a few are edible and very interesting to wildlife. But again, there's 180. So, I would not go eating any berries that you identified by hand. There's just too many species which are probably too similar, and it probably takes an expert. I wouldn't even try it. It's not like tulips or ginkgo. You haven't even got a good shot at this, seriously. So, but because of that, they get spread invasively a lot by wildlife, eating them, and then going to the little wildlife room later, somewhere else. They're especially beloved by Lepidoptera larvae, which are moths and butterflies, I believe. So caterpillars like to eat them, basically. They're kind of unique. The climbers need roots in shade, and the flowering tops in the sun. And the fruit is colored by phytochemicals, which is a vocabulary word of the day. It helps them resist fungi, bacteria, and plant viruses. Apparently, that's why the plants like it. We don't really understand phytochemicals very well and what they do, so it might be good for you, might kill you, might do other things too that we don't know about. Phyton is plant in Greek. So basically, the definition is the chemicals of plant origin. That's all it means. Phytochemicals, chemicals of plants.
Wait, is that PHYTO?
PHYTO, yeah.
Oh, okay. Wouldn't that be light activated chemicals?
You'd think, but I don't know. They said phyton equals plants, so I don't.
Okay.
But okay, photosynthesis is light activation. I don't know.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Ask an ancient Greek.
All right. I'll look for one. Okay. Keep going.
There you go. Well, that's about all I've got. So they're very popular. They smell extremely nice. They look pretty. And some of them are invasive, unfortunately, but it's hard to tell which ones.
Well, see, I didn't even know there were native North American because, a lot of places just talk about the invasive honeysuckle. That's and if you go, the reason what prompted for me is going down the Slippery Elm Trail, and there's tons and tons and tons of it. So,
Right.
yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot.
They may also have various health uses which we haven't really fully documented yet. So just don't mess with them without an expert.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks, Rebecca.
You're welcome. Have a good week.
You too. All righty. And I just want to do a little addendum to Rebecca's report there on honeysuckle, and that is that there is an easy way to tell the invasive honeysuckles from the regular honeysuckles. There's two ways. One is you cut a branch of it, and the invasive honeysuckle, which comes to us from Russia and South Asia, that one has a hollow center. So there's a little circle right in the middle, and that's how you tell an invasive honeysuckle from one of the native North American species. And the other way is a little more complicated. The leaves on the branches are opposite, so they're always right, directly across from each other all the way down the branch. So, and I guess the invasive honeysuckle is something you really do want to get rid of, because otherwise it will completely take over wherever they get started. Okay, so now it is time to move on to our ecological news segment. And we got some interesting ecological news. For the first story, we go over to Finland, beautiful Finland. And way back in March, we had the unfortunate task of reporting that the Olkiluoto 3 reactor had finally powered up. They actually turned it on over there in March. And that was a plant that was started in 2005. It was supposed to be done by 2009. So yeah, doing the math, it was 13 years behind schedule and took a total of 17 years to build. It also just about triple the estimated cost. The original cost estimate was 3 billion euros, and it's over 8 billion euros. And now we could say, and counting, because it turns out that even though they turned it on back in March, it's still never been hooked up to the grid in Finland. It's not supplying power to anybody. And they've had a terrible problem. Their feed water pumps are damaged. And the feed water pumps are the pumps that feed the water into the reactor and keep it from melting down. Now, the official statement is that this damage has no impact on safety, although you have to wonder how breaking the pumps that keep your plant from melting down has no impact on safety. But taking them at their word, it's still they have now put off the connection to the grid date well off into next year now, because they've got to replace these feed water pumps. And it's just uncanny how this, nuclear power has once again proved its ability to fail at the most critical time, because Finland is also suffering from a cutoff of Russian natural gas. And so they are now predicting there's going to be blackouts in Finland because the Olkiluoto 3 nuclear power plant will not be online in time to help out this winter. And so, the pro-nukers were all like, yay, it's a great victory, it's a new day for nuclear, way back in March when this plant finally started churning out nuclear waste, because that's all it's doing at this point, is making nuclear waste. It's not putting any electricity onto the grid, so all it is a nuclear waste factory. So they were like, that's a great victory, but I think most sane people would say that if it takes you 5 times as long as you predicted and costs 3 times as much, and then fails right at the most critical time when it's needed to keep the lights on in your country, most people would actually call that a failure. And speaking of failure, for our next story, we zip on down to Germany. And the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, has decided to fail to keep his campaign promise, which was to end all nuclear power by the end of this year in Germany, using the excuse of the Russian energy sanctions or the Russian energy embargo. He has decided he's going to keep all three of the plants that are currently running, and that is there's a plant, Neckarwastheim, and Egar 2, and there's one other plant that they're currently running, and they've decided he said they're going to keep them running until April 15th in order to get through the winter and without any German or without any Russian natural gas. And unfortunately, he's bowing to pressure from groups that are saying, it's worse to reopen a coal plant than it is to keep a nuclear plant running. The reason that is such a bad decision right now was pointed out by Greenpeace, and they're pointed out that what we're involved in now with like the Ukrainian war, something called hybrid warfare, where it's not just a matter of shelling targets and blowing things up and advancing your troops and so forth. If you destroy a nuke plant, you wipe out thousands and thousands of square miles of enemy territory. And we're learning every day in Ukraine that all you have to do is cut off the power to a functioning nuke plant. We're relearning this lesson. And if the backup diesel generators fail, then the nuke plant melts down. And I haven't even been reporting on how often this is happening in Ukraine, because it's literally almost every day that a nuke plant gets the power cut off, and then it's running on diesel, and then it restores the power, and then the power gets cut off again. Germany, if it's got running nuclear power plants and it suffers electrical failures, that's a small country compared to the United States. I think it's around the size of Ohio. So you can't, you're putting your entire population at risk. If you have a single meltdown, basically you may have to completely abandon Germany altogether. And this is a big deal because in the parliamentary system, the chancellor is not really like the president. The chancellor doesn't really. What happens is authority gets given over to the heads of each department in the cabinet. And so Robert Habeck is a Green Party person, and he is head of the Economy and Energy Department, and he's been fighting the extension of these nuclear plants. But another member of the party are the Free Democrats, and the Free Democrats run the finance department, finance section in the German government, and they've been they want to keep them open indefinitely. And so the chancellor did this quote-unquote compromise where he says, we'll just keep them running until April 15th. But like I said last week, my experience is you give pro-nukers an inch and they contaminate 1,000 square miles. If they manage to get this through, I would be very surprised if they follow through on this promise to close them down after the winter gets through. Just to sign again that if you start doing the nuclear thing, it gets very difficult to stop. Okay, next story. Off to Greenland for this one. And we've reported on Greenland before, how the ice sheets are melting. And we've reported before on the concept of positive feedback loops. Okay, class, everybody should know positive feedback loops are loops where the effect of something amplifies the cause of that thing. And then that amplifies the effect, and that amplifies the cause. And one big example is a nuclear bomb, where the effect of splitting an atom is releasing 2 neutrons that split 2 more atoms, and then those 2 atoms each release 2 more neutrons, then they split 4, and then 16 and 32, et cetera, until you get a massive explosion. Scientists have been very inaccurate in predicting the rate at which the Greenland ice sheets were going to melt. They've been wrong many times, and they're always too conservative. They're not predicting the melting fast enough. When they actually measure, they find it's melting much more quickly than any of their models predict. And there was a study came out D.A. Slater and F. Stranio. The title is Submarine Melting of Glaciers in Greenland Amplified by Atmospheric Warming, and that was in the journal Nature. What they're saying is, it turns out that the atmospheric warming, the air is getting hotter, and that causes the ice on the top of the glacier to melt. And we've always known that the ocean's getting warmer, and that's causing the bottoms of the glacier to melt. But what we didn't realize, and what this study shows, is that what happens is the melted water from the top of the glacier that was atmospherically melted pours off into the ocean, and that causes turbulence. That causes these huge roiling currents underneath the glacier, and that has the effect, kind of like running water, that erodes the bottom of the glacier much more quickly than just temperature, which is what all the models were relying on. They were just relying on temperature. But if you add in this turbulence, it turns out that it melts the underside of the glacier much faster, and that since the underside's melting faster, the whole thing gets thinner, and the whole glacier melts much more quickly. And if the glacier that's the part that's off the land and in the water, if that melts and collapses, then the glaciers on the land basically charge forward into the water. And so it looks like these glaciers are melting much more quickly than predicted, and now we know why. At least part of the reason is this turbulence that these scientists have discovered. So it's not looking good for the Greenland glacier, and if that does melt, we're talking levels of sea rise that will say goodbye to Florida. Tell your Florida relatives it's time to move back up north. Yeah, so that's kind of scary. Okay, now on to our last story, and I wanted to discuss this one a little bit because it has philosophical implications as well as just being a straight old ecology story. This is a story. It was in Science News on October 11th. It's out of Utah State University, and it turns out there's a title. And again, I'm going to complain about big, long, wordy titles. The title is Out of the Loop, Ecologists report short-term plant soil feedback experiments fall short in predicting competition outcome of long-term field experiments. And essentially what that means is that when they're trying to figure out the impact of things like changes in nutrients on the organisms that are in the soil versus the plants that are growing on top of it, what scientists like to do is pluck out a plant and a soil organism and put them in the same plot in a greenhouse where they can watch everything and control the temperature and make everything just nice and scientific, and then study how that one plant and that one soil microorganism interact. Well, it turns out that they've been doing this for decades because it's nice and simple to just go ahead and take the two things you want to study and plunk them in a greenhouse together. But it turns out that all the predictions based on that kind of research turns out to be wrong, because what this study did, it compared the predictions made with those sorts of studies to the actual field observations in the wild, where the scientists have been studying different areas that have lots of different plants and lots of different soils, and they find out that their little simplified model with one plant and one microorganism bears no relation to what nature actually does. And this is kind of going back to my introduction, which is just the incredible complexity of the field of ecology. In an ecological setting, there are hundreds and literally thousands of different kinds of microorganisms in the soil, and the plant that you're studying is competing with and cooperating with and interacting with dozens of other sorts of plants, and the complexity and the result that comes out of a rich ecological system, a rich natural system, literally can't be predicted by our European scientific method, which is where you pluck out little bits and pieces and you study them. And, this philosophy, I heard this repeated in MIT's Introduction to Ecology course, which is, and they were absolutely wrong. And what they said is that we're going to start studying ecology just by understanding the chemistry of single-celled organisms. And they say once you do that, once you understand the simplest, the base, then you understand everything. Then you can extrapolate and understand the whole. And that is completely wrong, because many things do not appear until you've reached certain levels of complexity. It's order that sort of appears out of chaos. So for example, you can understand completely all the chemical interactions in a let's say an algae cell, okay, and you can say, oh well, here the light comes in this way, and you've got the Krebs cycle, and the plant respires as well as photosynthesizes, and blah blah blah, and that's not going to let you predict the fact that in certain areas possums have learned to be groomers of the local deer population. Yeah, in some places possums will set up on a boulder and just wait, and the local deer will come to them and the possum will pick all the ticks off the deer. And how do you get from looking at the chemical processes inside an algae cell to the behaviors of big complex mammals and the way they interact with each other in the wild? And how do you say, well, in the areas, that how do you predict from an algae cell that areas that have possums have healthier deer populations than areas that don't? And so that changes the flora, and the fauna, because other things feed on the deer, and it's all, you have to be able to grasp the whole and understand the role that each and every single creature in it has in order to understand the ecology of an environment, or to understand human society too. Because it's easy to just look at the people that are in the headlines all the time. We know about Musk, we know about what's his name, Bill Gates, but you and I are just as important parts of human society as any of them. Because in the world of chaos, the smallest change in input can create huge changes in the output. And so if all of us keep fighting for and looking for the green future, we can have a bigger impact than some guy with billions of dollars, even though we're constantly being taught that isn't the case. There's many, many examples in human history where just one person who apparently had no power stood firm and changed everything. And so I'm asking you to be one of those people and help us get the green future. Thanks very much. We'll be back next week.
I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time